if you're a bigger guy, 6'5", or maybe you just like watches with a bit of a larger wrist presence, you may have noticed something. Rolex just doesn't make watches for you anymore. You had a lot of options with the Yacht Master and the Sea Dweller and the James Cameron, and perhaps even, to some extent, the Rolex Explorers. Now I feel like the average watch that Rolex produces does run a little small for people like that. Now, before I hear people in the comments saying, hey, you know what, wear what you like, wear what you enjoy, for me, it's all about proportion. You want to wear a watch that looks great on your wrist, not just a watch that you like. There's nothing more disappointing than, wearing a piece that you think is going to fit well, you think is going to look great, and once you put it on your wrist, it is just too small, it's dainty, and I think these days that's not something that a lot of men want to be associated with. I don't want to put a watch on my wrist and feel like I have a dainty watch on. I want to feel like I'm wearing a watch. As men, we work hard for these things. Of course, there's women in the watch industry as well, so shout out to those women. And it sucks to put something on your wrist and just feel like it's not the right fit. And I feel like the taller gentlemen in the hobby just get the short end of the stick when it comes to options. Now, why do I think that is? I think that Rolex these days, they're leaning more toward 36, 40, 41. I think as vintage is kind of making that comeback. And back then, there were just not a lot of large cases because that wasn't the style back then. I think that the 44mm watch is getting displaced. The thing that sucks too is when you look at these options, and it might just be me, but something I've noticed, the Yacht Master is difficult to read. The Sea Dweller can sometimes be too large. And I know that's contradictory to, my statement that you need a larger watch. I tried on that challenge Sea Dweller and it is just too large. Proportionally, going back to what we were saying earlier, proportionally, I think that is the most important thing when you're trying on a watch and wearing a watch. Is not necessarily how big it is, but how does it fit on your wrist and the proportions. I think that Rolex as a brand can sometimes favor those with a smaller wrist. And that sucks for people that have 7.5, 8.5 inch wrists. And I know those people, I'm friends with those people, and they tell me all the time, hey, Nick, I just don't have options. If I were you, what are some options that I would pick that maybe are Rolex? Zenith. I think that Zenith is a really unique and interesting brand. I think they use a lot of the tools that Rolex has at their disposal to create something that I think is really awesome. Most of their cases do run larger, and I think that that's an awesome opportunity to put something on your wrist that you enjoy. I think Panerai in general can sometimes be a little larger. I think it's a great option for those with larger wrists. Although I will say this, I would maybe stay away from the Radiomir models for my personal opinion, because I know Jeff might think differently, but the Radiomir I think it doesn't look as masculine and as imposing as a lot of these watches do when they're on the wrist. I know that when you are a larger guy, whether it be big or tall, you want to feel like you're wearing a watch rather. And I think it could be very difficult to, on the flip side of things, put a watch on that maybe is too big. I think of the 50mm Challenger. I think of that Radiomir that just, again, it just looks off to me. I can't really put my finger on it. I know that people have different opinions. That's what I love about this space. But if I was looking for a big 44mm piece, I would invest heavily in the Luminor model. I would, again, look in those and look at the fact that Zenith uses a lot of similar movements as Rolex does. And I wouldn't give up hope. Me personally, I like 42, 43. I think 44 can be a little bit larger on my wrist. I mean, you tell me. This is, that Sea Dweller on my wrist today. I did want to take some advice into consideration. Someone said, hey, you talk about Panerai, you talk about Omegas, you talk about all these really interesting pieces, and you very rarely will wear the piece that you're talking about. So I wanted to shout out to that commenter who did have a valid point. And so we made some changes, and I'm wearing this piece now. Now it's big and it's hefty, but it is a piece that I wouldn't normally wear. I think that proportion is something that a lot of dealers and a lot of collectors just don't really take into account as often and as heavily as they should. A piece can look really nice on a shorter person's wrist. It can look really nice on a smaller person's wrist. You put it on your wrist, and it just really feels like it's being engulfed by the rest of your arm, your wrist. It's something that I would just be careful of. I think that as much as I love fashion, I think to complement that, I think proportion is incredibly important. At Taylor Timepieces, we came up with that name because we really wanted to tailor the watch to your wrist. And I think that when it comes to larger Rolex models, I think a lot of people are just settling. They're settling with the Yacht Master. They're settling with the Sea Dweller. Now, I could be wrong. You could be a Sea Dweller aficionado. You could be a huge Yacht Master guy, and you're out on your boat and you're saying to me right now, Nick, I think you're wrong. I love my Yacht Master. It's a great piece to have. I love using all the functions on the piece, and it's not hard to read. Personally, I disagree, and that's great. That's what I love about this community is you can disagree, as long as you do so respectfully. I think that's a conversation to be had. Now, what would I like to see Rolex do more of? I would love for them to really spend that time and come up with a piece that complements those with a larger wrist that isn't just two models. Again, Sea Dweller, Yacht Master. Then what? I have so many collectors and so many people in my Rolodex that say, Nick, I have one of each of these models. I don't know where to go from here. And honestly, in those cases, I will direct him towards AP. I will direct him towards Panerai. And that's a crappy hand for Rolex because, of course, that's Rolex leaving the conversation. Now, if I was Rolex, I would want to be the center of the conversation in every conversation I had. So you guys tell me in the comments, what imaginary 44 plus millimeter watch would you design for Rolex that was proportional and smart looking? And I know maybe not something you could put under a cuff because it would be too large, but what do you want to see in the Rolex lineup and where you feel like there are holes, and how would we cover up and plug these holes so that Rolex could be a more complete brand? I love the brand. I think it's got a lot of history behind it. Everyone, no matter where you are in the world, will see the crown and know what you're talking about. But I do think that Rolex is missing an opportunity here to serve those with a larger wrist and those who just, like I said, want a little bit more wrist presence. So again, leave your comments below. Thanks for watching.